Welcome to the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This podcast is dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like all the best bookshops, this podcast is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. So tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book at the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. I'm Stacey Horan, author, book lover, and host of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet. This is episode number 186. For more information about this or any of our episodes, go to my website, staceyhoran.com. If you enjoy the podcast, leave us a review, like us on social media, and share us with your friends, family, and fellow readers. In today's episode of the Bookshop at the End of the Internet, I'm chatting with author Amanda Lees about her latest book, The Midwife's Child. It is the third book in a loosely connected series set during World War II, featuring female agents fighting in the resistance. Her main characters in the books are all based on real women who were decorated for their leadership and heroism during World War II. Amanda loves history and credits one of her teachers in a convent boarding school for sparking her interest in the subject at an early age. She admits that The Midwife's Child is the hardest book she has ever written. While the book is based on a real-life love story that Amanda came across during her research, the novel is partly set in Auschwitz. Amanda worked hard on this book as a way to honor those who were sent there, those who died, and those who survived, and to be true to what happened. But she is quick to point out that The Midwife's Child, like all the other books in the series, is a story filled with courage and hope. In this episode, I'll chat with Amanda about her writing journey, how coming back to the publishing industry after a long hiatus was a very different experience than when she first got started, and what she means when she says she writes dangerously, as well as a few other things. Coming up. Amanda Lees, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's brilliant to be here.
I thought what we could do today is start by talking about your latest book, The Midwife's Child. If you don't mind, tell us a little bit about this book and what inspired you to write it.
This was actually the hardest book I've ever written, essentially because a lot of it is set in Auschwitz, and I was so determined to get it right for many reasons. And I set it there because it's the third book in a very loosely linked series. So you don't essentially need to have read the other books to read this one. It stands alone. And the same holds true for the other books. But this particular character, and what I do with these books is I base them on real life stories. So it was based upon an amalgamation of agents who had been put in camps. And I wanted to tell the story of this particular agent, Maggie, who is a doctor by training. And within Auschwitz, there was this amazing resistance movement, which was based within the prisoners' hospital. And that got stronger and stronger as time went on within the camp. And I knew also that I wanted to have a love story at the heart of it. So I went looking for a real life love story as well. And I found the most brilliant one because I found an obituary of a Scottish commando who had married a young Hungarian Jewish woman who had survived a death march from Auschwitz, which is, there is a death march in my book as well. And they got married and they had 71 Valentine's Days together before she died in 2017. And I just love that story. So I based my hero on him, Jamie McLean, but I gave him the name of a friend of mine, whose father helped to start the SAS. So there were all these resonances in the book for me. But I also, through long sort of history and ties, I knew a lot of Hungarian Jewish men and women who'd been in Auschwitz, who'd shown me their tattoos. And I'd been to Hungary and spoken to my friend's grandparents, they were Hungarian Jewish, they had survived as well. And all of it stayed with me for years. And I kind of felt I had to honor them, the people whose love story I'd based the love story at the heart of the book on. And I guess that it was it was a responsibility to tell the best story I could while also making sure it was completely accurate. I wanted to convey, yes, the horror of it, but without making it, if you like, a sort of horror fest. I wanted to be true to them, to what actually happened, and essentially, to make sure that these stories keep being told if I write them, if other authors write them, because then hopefully people who are too young to learn about Auschwitz will, read my book, read other people's books, and understand what happened there.
Let's talk about your main characters. Can you tell us a little bit about Maggie?
Maggie, I just kind of, as I wrote her, I sort of fell in love with her. She wasn't a minor character in the first book, but obviously you give more weight to the person on whom you're centering the story. But in the first book, she was caught when she was trying to blow up a railway line, and that's what happened in real life. And as I wrote her, people have commented about Maggie, and they said, she would just wouldn't give up. She would never give up. And the thing was, in my own life at the time, I had all sorts of stuff going on, and I just refused to give up as well. And the weird thing about writing these books is I feel like, I've learned so much from the research, from these characters, from creating them based upon real people, that I wanted that to come through as well. Her resilience, her strength, her determination, her valor, the sheer bravery that Maggie exhibits throughout, and how she suffered as well. Because the other thing about her is that, and something people don't really talk about with World War II, is that she obviously suffered from what we call PTSD now, but back then sometimes was referred to as shell shock or combat shock. And of course, someone who'd been in Auschwitz and been in her situation would suffer. And she had clearly also suffered from an eating disorder, which is something I had helped to nurse someone through. And that again was something that I felt was important to get across. Not this is not to make this book a sort of pool of misery, because it's not. It's massively a story of hope and resilience. But it was also that people don't really talk about the actual effect on the agents, on the people who fought, on the people who were in the camps, and the long-lasting effects. So I was putting all this into Maggie, and she just sort of leapt off the page. And I think, it's very hard now to sort of uh, not supersede Maggie, but I sort of feel like, again, I owed her a debt, even though I know she's not real. She's a character I created, but I owed her something to make her as vivid as possible, because her story was so strong and so representative of her.
I usually ask authors at some point how much, real life they end up putting into their stories. And from what you just told us, you put quite a bit into just not only just the story itself, but the characters. I'm curious, how much of yourself do you find putting into the characters? And then conversely, how much do you find them affecting you?
I think it is impossible for an author not to put bits of themselves into every character. Excuse my cat; she's determined to invade this. It's impossible, because you inevitably can only really write from your perspective. And much as you will create a character, and I trained as an actress, so I learned to create characters. I was taught, Stanislavski, method acting, how to, I studied under Mike Lee, so I learned how to create a character through improvisation. But still, I think that, you've got to admit, inevitably, you will put parts of yourself into each and every character you write, because after all, we only live in our own heads, and we live life from our perspective. So yes, there's a huge amount of me in a lot of my characters. That's not to say, though, and this is where people get muddled up, I think, that, I haven't done the things my characters have done. What I have to do is try and imagine how it would feel, how I would react, how then they would react within a certain situation. And I think that's, I guess, where my acting training comes in really handy. So yeah, and I always thought from the very beginning of my writing career that the more you sort of poured of your own humanity into your characters, the more that they would then come to life for the reader.
Well, let's talk about the other books in the series, and in particular, the other main characters, the other two main characters. So in this series, you have three books out. The Midwife's Child is the most recent.
Hmm.
You started with The Silence Before Dawn and
Yeah,
followed that with Paris at First Light.
yeah.
So maybe introduce us a little bit to each of those two other stories. And then I want to talk about their characters and how you created them and how they are similar or different from Maggie.
Okay, so The Silence Before Dawn, the first in the series, is centered around Marianne. And she was she was based on a sort of amalgam of Nancy Wake. I don't know if your listeners have heard of her. She was known as the White Mouse to the Nazis who were desperately hunting her. And she was an incredibly feisty New Zealander who'd been a journalist and who married an extraordinarily wealthy man from Marseille and then decided to fight in the resistance. And she was incredible. She was brave. She led thousands of men essentially through collaborations with the resistance as well. And she kind of opened the series for me because she represented all the guts and brilliance and sheer bravery of these women. And it was very much the first time women had fought on the front line in this way. The second book, Paris at First Light, centers around Juliette, who is the leader of the resistance in the first book, works with Marianne, even though they spark off each other at first because they're strong women. But Juliette was based, I guess, mostly on Marie Madeleine Fourcade, who was extraordinary as well. She was a French woman who was decorated, as was Nancy Wake, for her bravery, and she had again thousands and thousands of men under her, and they between them both very much helped with what was called Operation Dragoon, which was kind of like the Southern Landings version of D-Day. And they were supposed to happen at the same time, but for various operational reasons, they didn't. And yet, in real life, these two women and many others of the agents and of the troops ensured that the southern landings happened, and so that the Germans were essentially pushed out of France once and for all by those landings in August 1944. So it was all centered around huge events in history, but I wanted really to make sure that it was the people who came through because it was them, it was the individuals and these characters, Marianne and Juliet, based upon these individuals who gave us our freedom.
How did you come across their stories? Was this an interest of yours that you've always had, history, in particular World War II, or is this something you stumbled upon and decided to learn more and write about it?
I love history. I went to a convent boarding school for my sins, and I had the most brilliant history teacher. And she did teach us about World War II, and she ignited a passion in me. But I have to confess that when I first thought of writing this series, my initial idea, and obviously listeners don't tell anyone, my initial idea was that I would bring SOE into the modern day. And every single editor kind of scratched their head and went, why? So I thought, you they have a point. So then I decided, obviously, I needed to set it in the time when SOE operated. So I started to research. And the more I researched, the more I uncovered their stories and read them, the more I realized that actually there were so many brilliant stories to tell and so many amazing people that this was what I had to write about. And I'm still, even now as I'm writing, because I'm writing the fourth book in the series, I'm still, I kind of, I don't know, I call it story hunting. I go hunting for the stories, the facts, for what happened, but I keep digging for tiny details and for people that no one's ever heard of. Because, we've all heard of people, and I'm not denigrating them at all by saying we've heard of, but, we've heard of Noor Inayat Khan, we've heard of Violette Chabo, but there are others that are not as well known, but who are just as extraordinary. So I wanted to reflect that in the series as well, and above all, to have these strong, incredible women at the center of it.
So switching gears then and writing historical fiction
Mm.
versus contemporary, do you find it difficult or constraining to set your stories in that time period, or is there a freedom in doing that?
Ooh, it's a bit of both.
Mm.
I mean, it's great because it means that, I don't have to worry on the one hand about modern technology, but then on the other hand, I have to learn about all the weapons they used, the vehicles they used. I have to absorb so many facts, not so I overload the story with it, but so that I know that I can picture what gun they were carrying, what vehicle they were in, what clothes they were wearing, even down to the labels in their clothing. I have to know what it felt and what it looked like. But there is a massive freedom as well in putting yourself in another world, which, World War II to us is another world now. And I love that because it means that, it sort of for me is bigger and full of more genuine heroes and heroines than perhaps I see around me today.
And you mentioned that you're working on book 4. Do you have a set number of books that you want to write in the series, or is it just a matter of writing books in the series based on whatever stories you find?
Well, I signed a contract to write 2 more in this
Okay.
series. I may well add some more to that. I have another series idea based in that time period. I'm also working on a contemporary crime series. So I constantly make up stories. It's what I do.
Well, let's talk about some of the other stories that you have made up, because these are not your first books,
No, not
these
at
three.
all. No, 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 no. So
So give us a rundown of some of the other books you have out there.
okay, so I started off, as I said, I used to be an actor, and then I kind of, when I was in a play in the West End, and a fellow actor went along to pitch to the BBC because at the time on Radio 4 they had a comedy show, and I went along to be his kind of, pitch buddy, and I got the job because I blurted out some kind of pitch, and that was great. So I started writing and I realized that actually I felt it was way more creative than acting because I was in control. So then I was sitting in the hairdresser one day and I'm reading a magazine and it tells me, how young women like me were earning pots of money writing books. And I thought, great, brilliant, because I'm always broke as an actor. So I wrote a book or a couple of sort of, chunks of a book, sent them off to agents. And the first one who said he'd buy me lunch, I was like, this is brilliant. I went off to lunch and he said, look, your writing's great. I don't like this story. Do you have another one? And I've been reading the National Enquirer, I'm sorry, on the way to lunch because it's full of great stories. So, and I read one, actually, I think it was based in Florida. I'm pretty sure it was. And the premise was that this man, it was the night before his wedding, and he and his bride to be, they had separate sort of, parties. He'd had his bachelor night. And then he decided perhaps to have one last little piece of entertainment. And so he did. And the the piece of entertainment he had hired came and knocked on his hotel room door, and it was his fiance. And because this happened in real life, I thought, brilliant. I'm gonna, so I pitched this as a book and I got the deal. I got a very nice 2-book deal based on I suppose you'd call it rom-com style fiction, though I like to think of it as satire. So I wrote those first 2 novels. And then I also wrote a couple of non-fiction just to kind of keep the money coming in while I was writing those, because you have to wait a long time to get paid when you're a writer. And then I had my daughter and I had a little break. And then I wrote a trilogy for young adults because my mum had died and I wanted to write something as a tribute to her. And because my mother was an extraordinary woman, my parents had met in the jungle in Borneo and had this amazing sort of exotic life. My dad died when I was little, but my mum was undeterred and took me and my sisters traveling all around the world from when I was tiny. And she particularly loved Nepal, Kathmandu, India. So I wrote this trilogy, all based around a girl goddess from a kind of kingdom beyond the Himalayas, who gets kidnapped and ends up in New York. And that did pretty well. And then I had another long hiatus because I became a single mum. And then my daughter was very, very ill for a long time. So I was basically looking after her. Now she's better. She's at university. And so these books are me kind of coming back into doing what I love best, which is writing. And they've done extraordinarily well. So I'm incredibly grateful, even though my daughter still hasn't read a single one of my books.
Really?
I know, and I've dedicated loads of them to her. I'm just like, you know, she's very grateful, but she doesn't actually read my books.
Do you talk to her about them? Does she feel like she's already read them because you've been working on them for so long, or do her interests just lie
Well,
elsewhere?
I mean, my daughter's studying engineering, mechatronics with AI and robotics. I just feel that we have very different brains. Also, I think it's embarrassing to read your mum's books, don't you?
Yeah, I can see that. I can
Yeah.
see that.
So I also wrote, so just before I wrote this series, I wrote a crime dictionary. In fact, the world's only and first dictionary of crime, which has been published in the States as the Dictionary of True Crime. And I did this because I went off to a book launch. And this is before I was, even thinking of my daughter still wasn't particularly well, and I had her with me. And I was talking to a publisher, and it was a launch for a slang dictionary. And I said to him, do you know what you should write? What you should publish actually is a crime dictionary because it's massive, true crime, crime fiction. And yet people don't know what all the acronyms stand for. They don't know police procedure. And he looked at me and went, well, you do it then. So I did. And it took me 2 years.
Mm.
But it was great. It came out in lockdown. My fellow crime writers love it. And they were extraordinarily nice about it. And I may well revise it at some point. But that sort of got me back into the fold. So that was great. And then my agent signed me up based on success of that and this series. And she's also a fantastic friend. So, I kind of feel like in a massive circular way, I've got back to the place where I belong.
You mentioned that you sort of came to writing
Mm.
a bit later. This wasn't something you were always doing, but I'm curious, as a kid, did you think about writing? Is it something you enjoyed doing?
Oh, I've always loved it. In fact,
Yeah.
my teachers at primary school in Hong Kong would say, she's going to be a writer. Her name will be on books. And because I'm quite contrary and stubborn, and also I really wanted to act as well, I went off and studied acting. And that's what my degree's in. And I did act, on stage, on a screen, and so on. But I always kind of knew in my head that I would end up writing.
Mm.
It wasn't even plan B. It was just I knew it was my destination. I just wanted to do other stuff along the way. And when I was telling you how I got started, because most people, a lot of aspiring writers, they're always fascinated in how authors get started or how they got a break or how they got
Mhm.
in there because there's so many different ways to do it. And I guess I wanted to say that, I was lucky. My story is not typical. And I didn't have to submit for years or strive for years at first. But then, when I had to get back into it, when I'd had my daughter and, I'd had to take a long break, it was hard. It was really hard. And I just kept persisting. And I suppose what I wanted to say to anyone listening who wants to write or who's in, sort of submission hell or they haven't quite got there yet, that I had to do it too, even though I had a body of work behind me that was, critically well reviewed and had done really well, and I had these deals and stuff. It didn't make any difference when I wanted to come back, I guess, into the industry. I just had to keep persisting as well and knocking on doors until, the stars aligned and everything fell back into place.
Yeah. Did you find that the industry had changed?
Massively.
Yeah.
As I mentioned, my publisher now, Bookshop, are digital first, which means that, I'm published in paperback and audio and ebook. But I love the transparency of their publishing model. So where, in the old days, my first huge deal I got a six-figure deal, but you never earn out on those deals, and that can completely cripple your career. Whereas someone like Bookshop, they don't pay advances. but then you are earning and they are earning if your books do well. And you get a bigger royalty share. And for me, it's a much more egalitarian approach. And I love the way they treat their authors and with huge respect. And again, as I've said, with transparency. And I think that's only great for the industry. And I think it's exciting because, these nimble publishers like Bookshop, like the other, uh, not smaller, if you like, because, they're huge. In fact, they're doing incredibly well, but they simply have a different publishing business model that has really evolved over the past 10 years or so. And it's so much better for authors and publishers alike. So yeah, it's changed and for the good.
Good. Because that's not something you always hear. That's not something necessarily that you see in media and the press, that
Yeah.
that it's changing for the better.
I think it is, and I think also people, that there is a tendency, if you get a bunch of authors together, as we did recently, we had a crime writers lunch that I went along to, and there's always one author who will be moaning about their publisher or their agent. Always. It's when authors get together, this happens. And often for legitimate reasons. But I have to say, genuinely, hand on heart, I love both my agent, adore her to bits, and I love my publisher. And I have been in the trenches, so I know what it's like when you don't, when things aren't going well. So for me, it's great, yes. And you don't always hear this, and I think for very, very many valid reasons. But I have to say that, touch wood, I'm very fortunate to be with the people I'm with, and they're a great team.
Well, since you've been at it for a while now, what do you find to be the biggest challenge for you in writing, on this writing journey? And what challenges you now? Is it the same thing that challenged you when you wrote that first two-book series way back when?
Ah, writing for me is like breathing. I love it. I can be in a sort of trance and I will write for hours. I find the actual writing part really easy once I've forced myself to just sit down and do it. And I'm constantly challenging myself. So I'm basically writing myself into a corner because I think if you do that, if you write dangerously and you scare yourself, then again, it's going to come more alive for your readers. So I'm constantly taking risks with my writing. I think I've always done that with my life. And because I just think you have to really go out there onto the edge to create what is hopefully a great story as opposed to just a good one.
And what do you find to be the best part of this writing journey?
Oh, I love it. I get to do what I love every single day. And I think that that for me is true success. If you are fortunate enough to be doing something you love, then great.
So at this point in your career, you've written a number of books and in a number of different genres, which is not necessarily typical for most writers.
Hmm.
Do you have a favorite? Is there one that you sort of find yourself drifting to when you're trying to think of something to write? Or for you is the fun in trying something new, different genres all the time?
I don't think I'm driven so much by thinking, right, I'm going to write, in this genre as in I'm going to write this story. So it's story led, and my stories start with the characters. So, a character will kind of come to me or an idea will pop into my head. And then it becomes obvious, I guess, what genre it should be. And as it did with this recent series, like the crime series I mentioned, that's because I knew I wanted to write a particular kind of story. And it's just kind of grown from there. And it's not, I don't suddenly think, right, I'm going to write contemporary crime. And I never ever write to the market. I don't think, oh, people are buying this at the moment, so I'm going to write that. I guess it's just I want to tell that particular story or stories, lots of them.
So clearly that's a goal to keep writing more books, more stories. Do you have other goals as a writer? What plans do you have? What goals do you have? And do you plan out the next year, 5 years, 10 years, or do you just take things as they come? Does your journey just grow organically?
Well, I'm what people call a pantser when it comes to writing. I have the plot in my head, but then I sit down each day and I'm never quite sure what's going to happen. And I'm kind of the same with life and with career, because they do say that man plans and God laughs. So I certainly, with the amount I am creating at the moment, I know what I'm doing for the next couple of years, because that will encompass the books I mentioned. I don't have a grand plan. I've learned that life absolutely will twist in the way it's going to. So I'm just grateful that I'm here, my daughter's here, and I'm doing what I love, and I'll keep doing that. I'd like to write more screen stuff. I've written plays and I've written for the screen before, and I loved it. And again, going back to, I was an actress. So for me, it's a natural fit. But again, that depends on story and coming up with the right one for the screen that goes, that would work better on screen than it would within a book.
Mm-hmm.
So it goes back to the love of what I do. And as long as I keep doing it, I'll be happy.
Good. Well, if people want to learn more about you and look for new releases, follow what's going on, where can they go to find you and that information?
Easy. At my website, which is amandalees.com, AMANDALEES for sugar.com. That's where I blog and I put all my latest releases. I'm also pretty active on Twitter and other social media, but essentially it will all be on my website.
And if people are looking to purchase a copy of The Midwife's Child or any of the other books that you have out, where should they go to buy them?
Okay, I feel bad for several reasons for saying this, but the best place to get them is Amazon. Sorry. I would love to say they're all over independent bookshops, but The Midwife's Child, they're all digital first, which means that Amazon is the best place. But, obviously I try and make sure that indie bookshops and any other outlets have them as well.
Good. Well, let's hope people pick up a copy, and we'll look forward to book number 4.
Yeah.
Hopefully coming out soon. Good. Well, Amanda, I want to thank you very much for joining me today on the podcast. And I want to wish you luck with The Midwife's Child and the entire series. So congratulations on everything you've accomplished so far, and best of luck with the rest of your writing journey.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
The Bookshop at the End of the Internet is a podcast dedicated to helping book lovers discover new authors. Like any good bookshop, this podcast features a wide variety of books by the equally varied and interesting authors who felt compelled to write them. This podcast gives you a chance to meet these wonderful writers and discover your next must-read book. Listen to the authors describe their books and tell you their stories in their own words. My interviews feature books from all genres and authors from all walks of life, including those who are indie published, as well as those published by small presses and large publishing houses. Looking for unique, not so easy to find books for yourself, a friend, or a book club? Tune into this podcast and find your newest favorite author, or maybe a soon-to-be bestseller. This podcast, like all the best bookshops, is filled with all kinds of books and all kinds of authors. Tune in, browse around, find a new author, and discover a new favorite book. You never know what treasures you might find in the Bookshop at the End of the Internet.